Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, Stephanie Desmond talks to David Victor, Professor of Innovation and Public Policy at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California at San Diego. They discuss climate change and why it's been so hard to change the behaviors of individuals, corporations, and governments, and the critical role of public health in motivating change for our environment. Let's listen.
David Victor, thanks so much for joining me.
Well, it's great to be with you today.
So tell us first a little bit about you and your expertise in climate change.
Well, I've been working on the climate change issue now for more than 30 years. When I was in college and then graduate school, the big environmental problem of the day was the ozone layer. I spent a lot of time working on that, both from a scientific point of view and on the politics of it. And frankly, we developed very effective solutions to that. And it was obvious that even then, the next really big problem was going to be climate change. It was going to be a lot harder. I started working on that from the point of view of international relations and how countries cooperate to address problems, or in this case, don't really cooperate to address problems. And that led me into very, very detailed work around the energy system and energy transition. And so that's been really the tenor of almost my life's work as a scholar is understanding technologies around energy systems and industrial systems that cause these emissions, and then understanding what they do ultimately in the atmosphere as they affect the climate.
I'm glad you mentioned ozone, because that seems to have been a major problem that we worked together and we fixed it. And now it's not the problem that we were very concerned it would be. Why is climate change different?
Well, in some sense, climate change actually isn't different. You know, when you go rewind the tape of history and go back to what did people really know at the time of the international accords on ozone, the key first accords were in 1987. They thought dealing with the problem was going to be actually very expensive. We didn't know what the technological solutions were. It turned out later on that many of the technologies came along faster than people originally expected. But at the time, people didn't know. They also didn't know what many of the effects were going to be. And so it's certainly not the problem of the same scale and magnitude as climate, but there are rhymes across the two. And one of the things that Chuck Sable and I have done in a book we published a few months ago called Fixing the Climate is go back to that history and show how, in the case of the ozone layer, people actually didn't know what the right solutions were going to be. And the systems they set up were learning systems, or what we call experimentalist systems. They were systems that were designed to get industry to collaborate, to run experiments, figure out what works, what doesn't work, decentralize the process of experimentation, and then re-centralize the process of learning which experiments are working, what does that mean for the policy goals, and so on. And that process of back and forth between decentralization and centralization explains why the ozone accords were so successful. And frankly, the failure to adopt that kind of process until fairly recently in climate change is part of the reason why efforts to deal with climate have not been as successful as ozone. Part of the reason also is that climate is even more central to the industrial economy. Fossil fuels are central to the industrial economy. They're about 80% of the world's energy system, depending on how you count, and that hasn't really budged very much. And so getting us off conventional high polluting activities is proving to be very, very difficult.
So things, I don't know, maybe I'm misinterpreting, but things to me feel like they're getting worse. That we keep hearing reports that actually it's not going to be the end of the century. It's going to be sooner than that when we run up against the limits that we should be under. And I'm wondering, and yet there's report after report sort of saying this. The UN recently had a report, and we're at this point where that report didn't feel like it really resonated with people. Like, to me, I started thinking, oh my gosh, we're running out of time. They keep telling us we're running out of time, but nobody's listening. Why aren't we listening? Are we really running out of time?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot in there. First, I don't think we're running out of time in the sense that the limits that people have been talking about for a long time are kind of contrived limits. So for many years, the goal was to stop warming at 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We're about 1.2, 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels right now. Most of that heat is going into the oceans. The system has a huge amount of inertia. So frankly, once it gets pointed in this direction, warming actually accelerates and takes a long time to control emissions and for that ultimately to have an impact on the atmosphere. So there's kind of a freight train moving there where we're likely to blow through 2 degrees. And we've been likely to do that actually for quite a long time. And so the goals that were set were aspirational goals. And frankly, nobody really knew how to stop warming at 2 degrees when those goals were set. We then spent a decade or longer not doing very much about the problem. And so we're going to go through those goals. We're going to go through 1.5 degrees. And so for all of the kind of Sturm und Drang about how those goals are being portrayed as like a cliff, if we don't stop emissions almost immediately, we're going to fall off this cliff at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which looks like that's going to happen, in the next 4 or 5 years. It could happen sooner, depending on variations in the weather. It could happen later, but we're headed that direction. It's not a cliff. There are cliff-like properties to the climate, but we don't know where the cliffs are. And so I think in that sense, we're not running out of time, but every year we don't take more decisive action is a year where we're kind of committing the world for more warming. And I think that's the way to think about this here is what are the kinds of commitments that are being made because of not doing enough. I do think when you take a step back, and just 2 other things to say about this. One is that when you take a step back and look at where we are, we've actually made quite a lot of progress. 10, 15 years ago, we were on track for maybe 4 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, maybe 5. That's a huge amount of warming. So much climate change, really hard to actually estimate what the impacts are. Now we're on track for 2.5 to 3 degrees. That's still a lot of warming. That's more than 2. 2 was never, I think, feasible as a goal, but it's not 5. And that's the real measure of progress. And so we're not doing enough. And there's a good political reasons why we're not doing enough and so on. But we're beginning for a variety of reasons, and some of them are policy, to reduce those emissions and ultimately to slow the rate of warming, if not yet stopping warming. And that leads to the last point just very quickly, which is I think one of the reasons why people don't know what to do and they're not responding is because there's just a world of difference between the abstract global goals and then what do you do if you run a company, or what do you do as a matter of government policy, or what do you do if you're an individual and you have a house and you're not sure what, do I insulate, do I recycle, what do I do, and so on. And so I think that kind of clutching and gearing between the level of individual human action and the global problem, that's frankly not been that well articulated. We know a lot about what to do there, but that disconnect, I think, it contributes, not completely, but to the feeling that you can't really get much done.
So obviously we have to do something. So how do we push through this?
Well, first, I think we actually are doing a lot. And because of this disconnect between the abstract global goals, which are frankly not achievable, and there'll be a lot of hemming and hawing very soon. It's already begun a little bit about what do we do when we don't meet the 1.5 degree goal, and what about the 2 degree goal, and so on. So because of that, the actual progress is not as visible as it should be. What we're seeing in industry after industry is that not all firms, but enough of the leaders are breaking ranks with the rest of the industry because they recognize, in some cases, it's existential for them, politically existential. If you're an oil and gas company, you're based in Europe, and you're not doing something serious about climate, your license to operate is in play. Your employees hate you. You can't sponsor art museums, like a variety of other things that are really catastrophic for these people. Those are in play. And so does that mean that they shifted all their capital to zero carbon solutions? No. But over time, the fraction of the capital spend is being shifted to low carbon futures and testing lots of different ideas. That fraction has risen. And now you're starting to see that with a bunch of the American companies, not all of them. And so you're seeing, that's just a particular illustration in oil and gas. And you're seeing something similar in steel, something similar in aluminum, cement to some degree. Certainly the electric power sector. The electric power sector is now doing more really than any other sector. We've seen emissions come actually down in absolute amounts in the United States, some because of luck, inexpensive natural gas thanks to fracking, some because of policy. The role of policy over time has been growing. You see that with renewables. You see that with the extension of nuclear plants in some places, like here in California, with Diablo Canyon being extended at least for 5 years. So you put all that together, and those are the real signs of progress, but they're much more granular. They're not at the global abstract level. They're in the industry by industry. And then what happens over time is these firms change facts on the ground. They create new businesses that are in the low carbon world. And then once you start deploying capital around that, then that creates an interest group basically that wants to do more of that. And you see that solar and wind are very, very powerful interest groups. Electric vehicles are very powerful interest groups these days. And so by changing the technological facts on the ground, you're changing change in the politics as well. And it's those two together that explains the success that we're seeing now.
Are we, in the United States, we seem to be less responsive than Europe has been. Why do you think that's the case?
I think some of this is political structure. Almost all the major European governments are coalition governments. They tend to be parliamentary systems, not exclusively, but tend to be parliamentary systems. Our system is much more reliant upon what's often called first past the post, or electoral systems, where the person who gets the most votes gets the entire district. And so our system can lead to more political polarization, whereas the European system lasts. There's a lot of reasons for that. But to me, what's interesting is that almost every coalition and government in Europe, even coalition governments led by center-right, more conservative parties, have brought climate change into the center. And partly that's because of the electoral reality. If you're not serious about climate, you're not viable unless you're a fringe right-wing, ultra-right-wing candidate in practically any European government outside of Hungary and a few other places. And so that's really changed the politics inside Europe. And thus you see, we've had Germany led for a long time by a center-right government, where the Germans are among the world's leaders in climate. Whereas the United States, at the federal level of politics, really blows left and right, makes it harder for us to send credible signals to industry, at least with federal policy. That's now shifting quite a lot. And the Inflation Reduction Act is a good example of that. And those funds will be there for a long time. So there are some projects that will be subsidized under the Inflation Reduction Act that will run out to the 2040s. And so you've seen a huge dose of credibility in the American response at the federal level, and in half the states, roughly. You've already had a lot of credible state level policy. And you put all that together, and it's not that the entire landscape in America is now concerned about climate change and doing things like climate change, but that logic that has been there for a long time in Europe, that logic is now spreading across the American countryside.
Mm-hmm. Do you see us shifting more toward, a green world in the United States because we have to, because we want to? Where's this going?
I think all the above. I think what's interesting is that for a long time, what I find interesting at least, is that for a long time, the climate change issue has been thought of as an elite issue. The climate scientists tell us what to do. They bring out a big chalkboard. They do lecture us on the science. Great. But it's not really an elite issue. Ultimately, it's how does a society see its welfare at stake, both in not doing something about climate change and thus the need to avoid those kinds of harms, and its welfare at stake in terms of creating new industries. And it's that's really juiced the politics on the climate change problems. You look at the Inflation Reduction Act, or before that, the so-called CHIPS Act, which is often thought of as a semiconductors act, but it's actually also a lot of spending about R&D across the board, including for energy and climate-related topics. The politics in both of those are politics around creating American jobs, onshoring, and so on. I think one of the tricks for policymakers these days is those are dynamite politics. They're very, very successful. That's how Joe Manchin describes his interest in voting for the Inflation Reduction Act, or writing and voting for the Inflation Reduction Act. We have to be careful that we don't overdo it, that we alienate, in effect, our major trading partners, because the value in creating these new industries is not only in creating the industries with a market in the United States, but also in markets globally. And that's how solar got cheap. That's how wind got inexpensive. That's how batteries have become inexpensive. It's because they became global technologies. And the same will be true for electrolyzers, for hydrogen, and all the other elements of a clean industrial future. And if we overdo it with the onshoring, we could actually gum up the works and drive up the costs and reduce American competitiveness.
So this podcast typically focuses on public health. What do you see as the future of public health regards to climate change?
I think public health is possibly the number one way that people are really going to become concerned about climate change. Is you see the really big harms created by the physical effects of climate change. We often think of them as hurricanes. So hurricanes cause a lot of harm. They also cause a lot of harm to the insurance industry that insures those risks and so on. The really big economic and social harm, though, is extreme heat. Extreme heat kills. Extreme heat radically reduces the productivity of people who work outdoors, with higher temperatures, higher humidity, and so on. And where people see those effects, that has real tangible impacts, harmful impacts on local communities. In some cases, in extreme cases, empties out local communities because they become unlivable. And so those are the ways that I think people are going to see be more concerned about climate as they see it affecting things that they care about, of which health is paramount. The other thing I think that's interesting is the ways that action on climate change resonate with things that we've been talking about doing for a long time, reducing criteria air pollutants, local air pollution, coming from coal plants, coming from automobiles, from diesel automobiles in particular, and trucks and so on, that can be regulated in various ways to reduce the local air pollution, but can also be switched to alternative fuels and technologies in a way that not only reduces local air pollution, but also reduces the emissions that cause climate change. And identifying those win-win opportunities are fundamentally public health win-win opportunities because they generate these tangible benefits. You look at soot, for example. Soot remains around the world one of the largest killers of people because fine particulate matter gets lodged deep in the lungs, causes a variety of health effects, harmful health impacts. And reducing soot while also cleaning up fuels is a way to both address local health impacts, including health impacts on communities that have historically suffered the most from infrastructure, while also addressing climate.
My last question is this. Would you consider yourself an optimist on us fixing this problem before it fixes us?
Well, I consider myself a realist, which means that we need to set goals that are achievable, that are stretch goals, but are achievable, that are adjusted in light of experience. I'm overall optimistic because I've seen the progress that's been made so far, which has reduced the track of warming from 4 or 5 degrees down to 2.5 degrees plus or minus. In that sense, I'm optimistic, but you got to be realistic. We're in for a significant amount of climate change. And also we're in for climate change that disproportionately affects the parts of the American society and the global society that are least capable of being prepared. That tends to be places that have more fragile institutions, tends to be places that are not as wealthy, not as well organized politically. And ironically, and a deep irony in the whole problem is that those are the places that disproportionately also didn't cause the climate change problem. And that's the kind of core injustice in the problem. And we got to be realistic about the need to address that and to deal with the reality that a lot more of that harm is going to disproportionately fall into those communities least ready for it.
David Victor, thanks so much for joining me.
Well, great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.